Our next speaker is one great gentleman from Iroku. I'm sure most of us have used Iroku, and this is the first time that a gentleman or a speaker or someone from Iroku is at this conference. And I think we'll have a conversation after the conference. Caleb Thompson will be presenting how he built software to kill people. Okay, so you can follow Caleb Thompson at Caleb Thompson on Twitter. He's a speaker, a developer, a painter, a gamer, an eccentric, eclectic. Caleb is currently coding mostly in Ruby and Go. He's not a fan of the SPA. He has braved the wintry tundra of Alaska and the ash desert of Arizona. He has fired a Mosin Nagant, I don't know what that is, without blinking, fought the Red Menace, built battleship couch, and killed a bear and wore its pelt. He enjoys fine wines, craft beers, and punching comets. A great CV you have there.
All right. Yes, I know that these slides are blank. Know that they are not broken. Hi, this talk is called Don't Get Distracted. Sometimes it's also called How I Built Software to Kill People, which it might be today. I've been a developer for about 10 years. I have a degree in software engineering, and I've worked in software jobs in various industries, from a consultancy to where I'm building things for all sorts of clients, including tools for social support networks for people affected by type 1 diabetes, shipping rate comparison service, and even a solar finance company. These slides are not broken. Doesn't matter. The slides are blank. I've even worked on task management software for banks. Now I work at Heroku on the support team, where I help all sorts of developers like yourself with some pretty interesting problems deploying their code to our platform. And I'm also part of the Ruby task force, where I help maintain the tools that turn code into running applications. For the past 4 years, I've organized Keep Ruby Weird, a community-oriented Ruby conference much like this one, based in Austin, Texas. And now I organize Speaker, a conference for speakers on the craft of speaking. Don't worry about it, Michael. That's right, that's accurate. Come find me later if you're interested in becoming a tech conference speaker or interested in upping your game to become an even better speaker than you already are. I'm going to tell you a story about how I took a job building software to kill people. But don't get distracted by that. I didn't know it at the time. Even before I'd walked across the stage of graduation, I had accepted an offer for an internship. It would pay half again as much as the most I had ever made, and I'd gotten the job during college when I wasn't making any money at all, just living on student loans. I'd be joining a contracting company for the Department of Defense, or DoD, which is the part of the military in the United States that's made up, or the part of the government in the United States that's made up by the military. The DoD outsource all sorts of things, from P-8A multi-mission maritime aircraft to Blue Shade 451 poly wool cloth. They also outsource a lot of software projects. At the time, I thought nothing of the fact that I'd be working for the military. Besides, they're the good folks, right? My dad was in the military, and so was my grandfather. I have great respect for those who work in the military. It was good money, a great opportunity, and a close friend of mine had gotten me this gig. Life was good. So I showed up at the first day of work in North Virginia, or NOVA, as the industry likes to call it. I met the team of other interns and learned what we'd be building, a tool to find Wi-Fi hotspots based on the signal strength of your phone. This seemed pretty cool compared to what I'd built up to this point. The most complicated thing I'd ever created was an inventory management system. The app didn't concern itself too much with persistence or databases. Besides, the data is right there in memory, and if it forgets how many Aerosmith CDs you have, who cares? Honestly, the idea of finding Wi-Fi routers based on the signal strength changing was pretty intimidating to me at the time. The idea impressed me. But don't get distracted by all this. The software was intended to kill people. The talk is going to start getting a little bit technical here. So if you don't follow along, don't worry about it. This is much more about the story than it is about the tech. I joined the team after they'd already gotten started on the project. The gist of the tool was that it would look at how Wi-Fi signal strength changed as your phone moved around. If the signal strength got stronger, you were probably moving closer to the signal. And if it got weaker, you were probably moving further away. To find that, we'd collect 2 pieces of information from the phone each time, several times a second. The location of the phone from the GPS and the signal strength of every Wi-Fi hotspot in range. To predict the actual location of the Wi-Fi signal, we used a convolution of 2 algorithms. The first was R squared. It measures the distance between the signal strength we would expect at a given distance and the actual distance, and the actual signal strength. Locations with the lowest R squared error rate, so the distances that were closest to the observed signal strength, were most likely to be the source of the Wi-Fi signal. We would combine that calculation with a Gaussian estimate, which is a probability curve based on the standard distribution, the bell curve that you've probably seen all over the place. The first was an inverted curve, which suggests that if you're trying to find something, you're probably not standing right next to it when you're trying to do it. And the second was a normal bell curve, so they added those 2 together into a single chart and said, it's somewhere further out here, most likely. It adjusted the width and height of each of those curves based on past measurements to get a closer idea of where the signal was originating from. We'd normalize the probabilities for those 2 algorithms for each location in a search grid. The combination of probabilities was more accurate than either algorithm itself could be. We stored this probability matrix for each location a phone collected from. Using these, if we collected readings while moving in a straight line, we could tell you how far away a signal was. If you turned a corner, we could also tell you its direction in 2-dimensional space. Climb some stairs, and we can give you its altitude as well so that we can pinpoint exactly where it is. This technology was the most interesting project that I had ever worked on. It's probably still the most interesting project. But don't get distracted by this. It was designed to kill people. I mentioned I had a software engineering degree at this point. My teammates were earlier in their education careers. Most of them were a year or 2 into 4-year programs, and they were a mix of computer science and math majors. My expertise was in the design and process of building software, while theirs was more in the high-level mathematics involved in the programming, or the theory of how processors work. So I helped translate the working algorithms that they had created in MATLAB into Java code that we would need to run on the Android phones. And let's be honest, we spent plenty of time bike shedding whether we should use Eclipse or NetBeans, or where the code should live in the repository. Can I just say how happy I am that as a Ruby developer, I haven't had to figure out where to put a jar file in almost a decade? I spent a lot of time bike shedding code organization options and pairing on performance improvements to the code. It all worked, but it took about 7 minutes to find things. This is partially because we translated that code from MATLAB, which is optimized for working with matrices of numbers. But the Java code that we originally wrote was using super nested loops. We're talking quadruply nested here with some really expensive calculations inside. One example is calculating the distance between 2 points. We were using great circle distance, which is the way that you measure the shortest distance between 2 points on the surface of a sphere, such as Earth. The function performing this calculation was being hit hundreds of thousands of times for each collection point, and often with the same 2 pieces of data. It was very slow. So we solved that by implementing a hash where the keys were the locations and the values were the distances between them. That was cheap memoization, which means that we could do the calculation one time and then not have to redo it later. That and other optimizations we made sped up the performance from 7 minutes to just a few seconds. But don't get distracted by that. The performance increase made it faster to kill people. The accuracy of these locations wasn't fantastic. I don't remember exactly what it was before we focused on improving this, but an average error of about 45 feet or 14 meters sticks in my head. It's about the length of the shipping container, and that's significant when the Wi-Fi range for 802.11n is only about 100 meters. 100 feet, I'm sorry, so 30 meters. That meant that we could be half the range of the Wi-Fi router away from where the location actually was. So I talked about the Gaussian estimate, the bell curves from the standard distribution from the second algorithm. We hard-coded the numbers that defined the starting points for those curves. They were only starting points, but they were used every single time we made this calculation. Does anyone know what a genetic algorithm is? It's a type of machine learning program that takes a set of values and optimizes them for a desired result. So if we say that each of the Gaussian estimation values is a gene, and a set of values is a genome, then these genes were our 3 constants, and we had a genome made out of them. A fitness function in a genetic algorithm is used to measure the performance of a genome. So for the data sets of readings I was using, I knew the actual location of the access points that I was trying to find. That meant that I could run the geolocation algorithm with each genome's values in place. I could look at the distance between the actual location and the calculated location and calculate a fitness score based on how far away that was, where lower is better. So genetic algorithms take this set of genomes, called a generation, and they keep a certain percentage of top performers every time they run. The top performers survive to the next generation as copies. Sometimes the algorithm mutates these copies by adding a Gaussian random value to each gene, which is different than the Gaussian estimation, don't worry about it. This means that there's a chance that any of the copied genomes, even if they were top performers, would be changed slightly so that maybe they could be better. That way, they had a chance of performing better or worse. New random genomes are created for the rest of the remaining slots. So we kept the top 10%, might have mutated them, and 90% were entirely random. We saved the top performers across every population, so that when the GA ended, I could look at the values and select the very best performer. I let this genetic algorithm run over the weekend. It was able to increase the accuracy from those 15 meters to about 3 meters, 25% the error of the original. That's less than the GPS accuracy on the smartphones we were collecting data from. And that meant that it might not actually have been accurate in the real world. When this happens, it's called overfitting. And the way around it is to have separate sets of test data and training data. But that's all stuff that I didn't know at the time. I loved this stuff. Genetic algorithms, R-squared, Gaussian estimation, these are the sorts of things that they teach you in school but tell you you'll never need to use. We were using them in a real-world project. This was fantastic. But don't let that distract you. The accuracy made it easier for the software to kill people. The location algorithm now worked quickly and accurately. The next feature was to track a moving Wi-Fi access point. I briefly wondered why a Wi-Fi access point would be moving, but that question wasn't as interesting as trying to find it. We made use of Kalman filters to observe 3 state variables: the position, velocity, and acceleration of the Wi-Fi signal. Given these, and the time since the last calculation, a Kalman filter is able to improve the current prediction surprisingly well. It filters out noise data that has low accuracy automatically. And a Kalman filter is actually the same thing that they use in the spam filter for your email. Each time we ran this real-time algorithm, we'd also feed that data into the Kalman filter. With only that information, I was able to produce an estimate that was a weighted average of the previous data, a new predicted location that was more accurate than the calculated value. At the same time, we added the ability to track multiple Wi-Fi hotspots. We'd filter our collection of readings by the unique identifier of each access point, the SSID. The filtered datasets went through the full algorithm separately, and they were able to produce their own predictions. We used the APIs on the phone to collect the signal strength of every Wi-Fi access point in range. We were able to track multiple hotspots, basically whatever you could see in your Wi-Fi connection list at a given time. And we could track them if they were moving. It was all very exciting. These seem like academic problems, but we were getting to use them in a real project. Being a programmer was going to be great. But don't let that distract you. This meant that we could use the software to kill multiple people. We'd been working with a project owner throughout this process. He was hands-off about most things. He might check in once a day, and then he would go back to his main job in the area of the building dedicated to classified work. Whenever we hit one of these milestones, we'd tell him about it, and he'd be happy with us. But the same question always came up. He wanted to sniff for the signals put out by phones instead of only just the Wi-Fi hotspots. Now that's a much harder problem from a technical perspective because the functionality necessary to do this is hidden behind a setting on the wireless network controller called promiscuous mode. Neither iPhone nor Android supported that option, so we would need to jailbreak or root the phone. We looked for packages that could do that, and that would let us sniff the packets that were sent back to the router. We found something on SourceForge, which is like an older version of GitHub. Like before Bitbucket and GitHub and GitLab, there was SourceForge, and that's where people went and stored their code. We found something that purported to do that, but it wasn't very well documented, and we didn't really understand how it worked. So at that point, we told the project owner, hey, can we come back to this later? None of us thought this was that important. We had the technology to find Wi-Fi hotspots working, and that was the goal. But each time we demonstrated new, exciting tech that we had built, this same question came up. We got Wi-Fi hotspots working. Great. Does it find phones? It's taking seconds instead of minutes. Great. Does it find phones? We looked into it finding phones, and it seems unlikely, but maybe. Can we come back to that later? Sure, we'll come back to that. We got moving targets working. Great. Does it find phones? I had been distracted. All these cool problems we were solving, finding nodes, speeding things up, making more accurate predictions, it was all so cool, so much fun. I hadn't thought about why we were putting so much work into finding a better place to sit and get good Wi-Fi. If you think about it for more than a few seconds, that doesn't even make sense. Nobody has that problem in the real world, and it's certainly not a problem that the government is going to pay it and try to solve. Does it find phones? This had never been about finding better Wi-Fi. It had always been about finding phones. Phones carried by people. Remember when I said I was working for the Department of Defense contractor? The DoD is the military. I was building a tool for the military to find people based on where their phones were and shoot them. I tried to rationalize this then. The military is in place to protect truth, justice, and the American way. But this is the same time that we found out that the government had been spying on Americans in the United States with drones, and that they'd lent out that technology to state, local, and federal law enforcement over 700 times in that year to run missions. The military is a tool of the government, and it didn't seem like we could trust the government to use that tool as well as we had thought. I didn't want to be a part of something that would be used to kill people, especially since I knew I would never have a say in who it would be used against or even know. I rationalize it now too. We were interns, and the projects that this company did for the government required top secret clearances. We didn't have those. I wasn't allowed to know what projects they were working on. My code probably got thrown away and forgotten. Hopefully. This is an extreme example of code that was used in a way that the creator didn't intend it. The project owner conveniently left out the purpose when he was explaining the goals, and I conveniently didn't focus too much on that part. It was great pay for me at the time. It was a great project. Maybe I just didn't want to know what it would be used for. I was distracted by the technology, but it would be just as easy to be distracted by a cool framework that a company was using, or the great design of an app that would look really good in your portfolio. Maybe some really nice office amenities. You got to get that free snacks. Others are doing this already, right? So it must be okay. They've thought about this, right? That's just another distraction. There are other examples of code that was used in ways that it wasn't intended, and of code that just does bad things. A couple years ago, a developer named Bill Sorer wrote a blog post. It opened with the line, if you write code for a living, there's a chance that at some point in your career, someone will ask you to code something that's a little deceitful, if not downright unethical. Bill had been asked to create a quiz that would almost always give the same result, the result that benefited his client. Bill worked in Canada, and in Canada there are laws in place that limit how pharmaceutical companies can advertise prescription drugs to customers. Anyone can learn about the general symptoms that a drug addresses, but only patients with prescriptions can get specific information. Because of this law, the quiz was posing as a general information site and not as an advertisement for the specific drug. If the user didn't answer that either they were allergic to this drug or that they were already taking it, every result suggested that they try it. That's what the requirements said to do, and that's what Bill coded up. The project manager for this project did a quick test before submitting the website to the client. She told Bill that the quiz was broken. It's always giving this same result. Those were the requirements, Bill said. Oh, okay, she said, and they shipped the quiz. A little while later, Bill got an email from a colleague that had a link to a news article. A young woman had taken the drug that Bill had built the quiz for. She'd killed herself. It turns out that some of the main side effects of the drug were severe depression and suicidal thoughts. Nothing Bill did was illegal. Like me, Bill was a young developer making great money and doing what he was told. The purpose of the site was to push a particular product. That's why it was being built. He'd chalked all this up to marketing. He never intended for this to happen. Maybe Bill got distracted too. As his conclusion, Bill writes, "As developers, we're often one of the last lines of defense against potentially dangerous and unethical practices. We're approaching a time where software will drive the vehicle that transports your family to soccer practice. There are already AI programs that help doctors diagnose disease. It's not hard to imagine them recommending the prescription drugs as well. The more software continues to take over every aspect of our lives, the more important it will be for us to take a stand and ensure that our ethics are ever present in our code. Since that day, I always try to think twice about the effects of my code before I write it. I hope that you will too." It's poignant to me that almost all of the examples that Bill used here for code that's coming soon are things that are here today. Bill's story isn't that far off from mine, but there are other examples as well. Earlier a couple years ago, a story came out that Uber had built into its ride-sharing app code that they called Grayball. It's a feature of their violation of terms of service tool that can populate the screen of your Uber app with fake cars when the app is opened. In a statement, Uber says, "The program denies ride requests to users who are violating our terms of service, whether that's people aiming to physically harm drivers, competitors looking to disrupt operations, or opponents who collude with officials on secret stings meant to entrap drivers." In practice, as the New York Times reports, it was used in Portland to avoid code enforcement officers working to build a case against Uber for operating without a license. When triggered by Uber's logic, it populates the app with cars that don't exist, with fake drivers who quickly cancel after accepting a ride. I'm not a lawyer, but this seems like obstruction of justice, itself a crime outside of Uber's unlawful operations in Portland. Grayball is used even today, though mostly outside of the United States. Now, I'm a huge fan of ride-sharing services. I took an Uber to get here today. But it's not uncommon to see news articles these days about heinous things these drivers are doing. Grayball may have enabled some of those things to happen. Again, it's an unintended tool of a consequence of a tool being built. Maybe the internal pitch was just to Grayball users who were in violation of the terms of service, people who were under 18 and using the app, or who didn't pay to clean up their late-night explosive accidents. Rather than block them, probably just causing them to create a new account, they could be put into an alternate dimension where just for some reason they could never get rides. Maybe that's why we're having trouble. If these developers had thought about the worst possible case of what their code could be used for, maybe obstruction of an investigation into Uber's shady dealings in Portland would have come up, and they could have addressed that early on. Maybe they were distracted by the face value of this request from looking deeper at the purpose and uses. There's all sorts of things that aren't as black and white as well. Apps that always listen to your microphone to tailor ads to you based on what you say near your phone. Websites designed to exploit psychology to take up as much of your time as possible which has been correlated to skyrocketing depression rates. Any number of apps that opt you into mailing lists when you sign up to purchase something. Now, these aren't as obviously bad as the previous stories, but at least in my opinion, they are kind of shady. This value system is different for others. Maybe you believe that ebooks are unethical because they use digital rights management. There are actually words for things that society decides are good or bad versus what you or I believe as individuals. Ethics and morals. While modern philosophy more or less uses these terms interchangeably, a common understanding between us will be important. Ethics are imposed by an outside group, a society, a profession, a community like ours, even where you live. Religions provide ethical systems, as do just groups of friends. Society, in whatever form, determines what's wrong and right, good and bad, and imposes those definitions on its members. Ethics in societies at the local, state, and national levels are often coded into laws by governments. Morals are a more perfect personal version of the same thing. Not perfect, a more personal version. Society as a whole imposes its mores on smaller communities, and all of that trickles down to the individual level. But that's not to say that your morals can't conflict with your ethics. For example, you might think that freedom of speech is a basic human right, but live in a place where burning the flag is illegal. So let's not get distracted by morals and ethics just yet. We'll come back to them. So thinking back to all those stories I told, the unifying factor is that developers wrote code to do these unethical or immoral things. As a profession, we have a superpower. We make computers do things. We build tools, and ultimately some responsibility lies with us to make sure that we think through how these tools will be used. Not just what their intention is, but also what misuses might come out of them. None of us want to build things that will be used for evil. The Association for Computing Machinery is a society dedicated to advancing computing as a science and profession. ACM includes this in their code of ethics and professional conduct. Well-intended actions, including those that accomplish assigned duties, may lead to harm unexpectedly. In such an event, the responsible person or persons are obligated to undo or mitigate the negative consequences as much as possible. One way to avoid unintentional harm is to carefully consider the potential impacts on all those affected by decisions made during design and implementation. So how can we carefully consider potential impacts? Honestly, I don't have all the answers to this. I don't really think that there is a universal answer yet, because if we had it, I have to believe that we wouldn't be building these tools in the first place. I do have a couple ideas. One is to add to the planning process a step where, like they say, just think through the worst possible cases of software being used. If you're opting people into an email list by default, the worst case is that we send them a bunch of unwanted email and they unsubscribe and maybe stop being a customer. Am I willing to sell my hypothetical startup soul for a bigger mailing list when that might be all that keeps the company afloat? Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense to me. I don't think that it's a best practice, but in the end, it's not physically hurting anyone. If I had sat down and thought about what the Wi-Fi location app could be used for in the worst possible case, I think it would have come up with a very different conclusion. Actually, I think if we think through the worst possible uses of code, it could be kind of a fun exercise. You might come up with some pretty wacky examples, like if we send Batman an email and he has notifications on his iPhone, then he might be looking at his phone instead of seeing the Riddler drive by in his Riddler mobile. And he might not catch him before he gets off his witty one-liner at the crime scene. Riddle me this, riddle me that. Who's afraid of the big black bat? Now, maybe that isn't too plausible, but it shows that some of these exercises can go down some pretty weird, different paths that aren't obvious at a glance. Another thing that I think I should have done, and that we can all do more of, is to simply not take that request at face value. The project owner at the defense contractor didn't spell out what the reason for the code was, but at least in retrospect, it wasn't a big leap of logic. We're going to build an app to find Wi-Fi signals was all true, but it wasn't the entire truth. Asking them or myself why enough times may have led me to an earlier understanding. Why? To find the sources. Why? To go to them. Why? Comedian Kumail Nanjiani, best known for his TV show Silicon Valley and his recent film The Big Sick, took to Twitter about a year ago on this subject. I know there's a lot of scary stuff in the world right now, but there's something I've been thinking about that I can't get out of my head. As a cast member on a show about tech, our job entails visiting tech companies, conferences, that kind of thing. We meet people eager to show off their new tech. Often we'll see tech that's scary. I don't mean weapons, I mean altering video, tech that violates privacy, stuff with obvious ethical issues. And we'll bring up our concerns to them. We're realizing that zero consideration seems to be given to the ethical implications of tech. They don't even have a pat, rehearsed answer. They're shocked at being asked, which means no one is asking these questions. We're not making it for that reason, but the way people choose to use it isn't our fault. Safeguards will develop. But tech is moving so fast. There's no way humanity or laws can keep up. We don't even know how to deal with open death threats online. Only can we do this. Never should we do this. We've seen this same blasé attitude in how Twitter and Facebook deal with abuse and fake news. Tech has the capacity to destroy us. We see the negative effect of social media. No ethical considerations are going into development of technologies. You can't put this stuff back into the box. Once it's out there, it's out there. And there are no guardians. It's terrifying. It's a major problem when we're given so much power in tech, but not doing anything to ensure that it's used safely. Thinking about what we're doing and being careful not to build things that can be used maliciously is really important. This is Chelsea Manning in an interview with the New Yorker Radio Hour, discussing the ethics of what developers do.
Now, I guess technologists should, realize that we have an ethical obligation to make decisions that go beyond just meeting deadlines or creating a product. Let's actually take some chunks of time and say, wait, what are the consequences of the system? How can this be used? How can this be misused? Let's try to figure out, how we can mitigate a software system from being misused, or decide whether or not you want to implement it at all. There are systems that, if misused, can be very dangerous.
Don't get distracted by deadlines and feature requests. Think about the consequences of what you're building. Build in safeguards to prevent misuse, or don't build it at all because it's too dangerous. I'm asking you to do something about this. I guess I'm asking you not to do something about this. It's only fair that we talk a bit about how and when to make that stand. Let's say I had a time machine and I could go back in time to 2011 and do it all over again. The tool has just been explained to me for the first time. What do I say? I already have foreknowledge that this tool is unethical. I've accepted the job. I've moved across the country from Tempe, Arizona to Brookville, Maryland. I've driven the 2-hour commute to Sterling, Virginia, home of 395 defense contractors, awarded $16.8 trillion in contracts over the past 16 years. It's my first job out of school, and it's my first day. I don't have a clearance, so I'm an intern. My new project owner introduces me to the team and pulls me into a side room to give me an overview of the project. What do I say? I think the first thing to do here is to understand a mutual understanding of the task. It's entirely possible at this point that I don't understand what the actual thing is, and that I'm overreacting. I ask, why are we finding these signals? And the project owner says, we want to find people's cell phones. Who's finding them, and why? I ask. I don't know, probably some soldiers in the Middle East. Why? I repeat. I can't tell you that. I can't tell you that is something that I heard a lot from this project owner. It was code for, I have a clearance, and I know the answer. I know things about this project, I know what you're asking, and I'm not allowed to tell you. At this point, I think we have our mutual understanding. The task is to help soldiers find people's phones, probably attached to those people. The reason is left unsaid, but we both know. This organization is a defense contractor. They build things for the military. It's their core competency. They're not going to do that. On the other hand, I care a lot about not killing people. The company's goal is to build things from the military, and the military is necessary. Sometimes they need to use force. Personally, however, I don't want to have anything to do with that. If my goal is not to build these tools, then there isn't a good fit for me at this company. This probably means that in the worst case, I'm leaving here today without a job. Either I'll say no and they'll fire me, or I'll say, this isn't something I'm comfortable with, but best of luck, and I'll quit. These are the worst case scenarios and not necessarily what would happen. So before saying no, I need to consider, can I afford to leave here without a job financially? Am I able to rely on my network to get me another job before my savings run out? Do I have the sort of trust with my employer where I can go to them with this type of question and actually be heard out instead of summarily shown the door? The answer for me in 2011 for all of those questions was no. Sometimes something is important enough that you should still take a stand. There's a lot that goes into that decision, and it has consequences. But I would like to think that I would still say no. Let's look at another situation where someone did the ethical thing. A developer we'll call Alice received a strange request. We want to identify weak passwords in the system and notify users to change them. We'd like you to run a password cracking program on the very, very large password database. Alice thought this was a weird request, but said that if the appropriate paperwork was completed, she'd be willing to do it. Alice received the completed paperwork and ran the password crack. The next request was, we'd like the user's emails along with the weak passwords. Now Alice knew that her coworkers had a valid desire to help customers improve their passwords. She also knew that users often reuse credentials. Combining the email and password into one report could allow someone to log into customers' accounts on other systems. Alice pointed this out to their manager, and together they worked together to build a tool that would tell people that they had a weak password but not actually tell them what the password was. Customers received notifications about their weak passwords, and there was less risk of the report falling into malicious hands. No one was fired, and Alice built up trust within her network. Different scenarios need different ways of analyzing what you should do. In some cases, the right thing to do is to say nothing and build the product. It's not a simple thing to make this decision. But don't get distracted by having